This is Bengals Central Podcast, keeping you up to date on all the Bengals news. Brought to you by ProFootballCentral.com. And now, here are your hosts, Sean O'Donnell and Chris Rowling.
Welcome to the Bengals Central Podcast, found exclusively on the Pro Football Central Radio Network and brought to you by Onnit.com, the company that delivers everything you need to thrive. I'm your host, Sean O'Donnell, and with me as always, my co-host, Chris Rowling. Chris, we have a jam-packed episode full of information from the draft and Bengals implications actually in fantasy football this year.
That's right, Sean. You know, we thought it would be cool to maybe take this lull in news between rookie minicamp and the just getting underway OTAs to talk to something about, close to our hearts, which is fake football, otherwise known as fantasy football. Now, you and I don't exactly claim to be experts by any stretch of the imagination. We leave that to the professionals. So that's who we went and got as our special guest today is one Mr. Shane Hallam, president of DraftTV.com and one of the Twitterverse's most active draft and fantasy experts to talk about the Bengals draft and how Cincinnati players stack up in fantasy football next season.
Absolutely, and speaking of fantasy football next season, let's just get right down to it because we actually have our guest of the hour and resident fantasy football expert, Shane Hallam, on the line right now. Bengals Central would now like to welcome Shane Hallam, president of DraftTV.com and our resident expert of all things fantasy football. Shane, how are you doing today?
I am doing extremely well. I appreciate you guys for having me on.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. We're really excited for you to be here with us today, Shane. We'll be able to use your expertise so you can kind of guide us through your thoughts and opinion on the Bengals 2013 draft, as well as any upcoming implications for the Bengals players in fantasy football in 2013. So I guess without further ado, Chris, let's get started with Shane here on the 2013 Bengals draft.
Yeah, so before we get to the more important world of fake football that we love so much, the Bengals had 10 draft picks, and we kind of wanted your opinion on, the draft class overall, maybe best pick, worst pick, things like that.
Yeah, I think it was a pretty good draft as a whole. Definitely one of my favorites among the picks. I think probably my favorite pick in terms of just pure value, I'm going to go to the 7th round, and I really like the pick of Reed Fragel, the offensive tackle from Ohio State. He's a guy that played tight end for most of his career at Ohio State, made the conversion to right tackle for the Buckeyes this past year and even showed some left tackle tendencies. I thought he was a player that someone could have taken in the 4th round as a developmental left tackle prospect or developmental right tackle prospect and maybe had a future starter on their hands. So to get that in the 7th round, I think is really good for the Bengals. Maybe not a big need or anything, but I think he's a player to look for. I think he was better than Tanner Hawkinson, their 5th round pick out of Kansas. And I like the first 2 picks a lot. I think to bolster this offense, Tyler Eifert is going to be phenomenal. I think that puts the writing on the wall for Jermaine Gresham, but I think Eifert, as he already showed in rookie OTAs, can catch anything. It's such a mismatch, just weapon out there, and it's perfect for this Gruden offense. I think he's a perfect fit for Andy Dalton as well. So I think he was my favorite skill position player. Adam Rayley is the best skill position player, even over Tavon Austin. I'd rather have Tyler Eifert, to be honest with you, creating those mismatches. And Giovanni Bernard is the first running back off the board. I thought it was a huge need. And if he stays healthy, I think he's going to be a really good one. Reminds me of Warrick Dunn for Atlanta years back. I think that's the player that Bernard could be. Probably the pick that I liked the least was Margus Hunt in the 2nd round, though I definitely understand the pick. Probably going to be a guy to replace Michael Johnson when he ultimately moves on in a year. But Margus Hunt has a lot of work to do. He could be a downright monster. You watch him in that bowl game that SMU played, and he has that pass rush. That size. There were teams looking at him as an offensive tackle. He's just a phenomenal athlete at his size and strength. But I was down at the Senior Bowl in Mobile and got to watch him in the game. And when you see a guy like Stephon Taylor out of Stanford who won the 6th round, ran a 4.6, just run right by Hunt because his hips lock out, there's a lot of fear for me of what he can do against the run. So I thought maybe the second round was a little bit too high for him. I liked him more as a third or fourth round pick. And then I'll just mention Sean Williams, the safety from Georgia. I think could have the most impact for this team year one. I really think he could be a starter at strong safety. Georgia had a lot of defenders in this draft, and they did not have a great defense. So something has to give. But I think Sean Williams is going to be one of the better ones if they keep him in the box, and I think he's a compliment with Reggie Nelson. I think the Bengals, second year in a row, I really like their draft. I really think they'll find some starters down the line.
That's some great insight, Shane. I got to tell you, our listeners are going to love your opinion about Mr. Tanner Hawkinson and Reed Fraggle there. What our listeners wouldn't like is if we didn't get an overall grade from you. So, the popular trend here is grades. So if you had to give a grade overall for the Bengals, what would it be?
Well, grades are always tough. I would probably give them a solid, A minus. I think I'd probably lean A minus with the Margus Hunt pick. And maybe some of the mid-round picks, I would have went a different direction. Sean Porter, I think is kind of a meh pick, and Hawkinson, like I said, I'm not the biggest fan of his, though he's athletic. So, but I think you're going to see an impact from this draft. I mean, I think this is one you're going to look back on. It's not going to be bust. I think Eifert's going to be sticking around for a long time. I think Giovanni Bernard, if the health holds up, is going to be your starting running back. And if that happens, and maybe Reed Fraggle emerges, or even Kobe Hamilton sticks on this roster for a little bit as a slot receiver, Rex Burkhead takes the Brian Leonard role. One other guy works out, then this is going to look like a really good draft down the line. So I'm going to kind of give it an A minus, as I think this will have an impact for the Bengals.
Nice. There's a couple things that I got to point out right there, Shane. And the first thing is that everybody who's listening, Shane Hallam just gave the Cincinnati Bengals an A- for the 2013 NFL Draft, which I might remind everybody was the exact same grade that I gave the Cincinnati Bengals. So I'm going to go ahead and pat myself on the back right now because I'm in Shane Hallam territory, and that is awesome. So, so one other thing that I got to say is, I haven't heard Giovanni Bernard compared to work done yet, and I've got to tell you that I really, really, really like that comparison. I don't know why I haven't heard that yet, but that's an absolute perfect player when you're looking at the skill set that Giovanni Bernard is bringing from North Carolina to Cincinnati. So that's awesome, man. That awesome insight, and that is obviously why we have you on the show right now for great stuff like that. Everybody, I'm sure, is getting the kick out of this right now. So that's awesome. Appreciate your draft insight. So let's move on to the other realm of fantasy football here. And, speaking of the rookies that have come out this year, obviously their first-round draft pick was Tyler Eifert, who, you said was one of your favorite, offensive weapons in the entire draft this year. How does Jermaine Gresham's presence either hurt or help Tyler Eifert in his first year in the league?
Well, I think if we're talking fantasy football and we're talking redraft, it kind of knocks out the Bengals tight end position from what you want to do because I think it's very, very difficult to say, I really like Tyler Eifert. I really like Jermaine Gresham. I think they're both guys that have bumped down my rankings and probably will bump down even a little bit more going forward just because I don't know who's going to get that football. There's only so many balls to go around. A.J. Green's still going to get a ton of targets. I think you're hoping that maybe a number 2 receiver might emerge as a late-round sleeper for your fantasy team in Mohamed Sanu. And I think year one, it's going to be making that decision. I think they're going to try to use both of them. I think they'll try to line up Eifert in the slot a lot, perhaps, and have Gresham still play in line a bit. But I think it hurts both of their values. I think for me, for the tight end position, which is fairly deep. I mean, you can get a guy like Dwayne Allen for the Colts or Martellus Bennett for the Bears pretty late this year. I'd probably just pass on the Bengals situation, maybe get Gresham really late or Eifert really late and take a flyer. But unfortunately for the immediate future, I think it hurts both their values. But I do a lot of dynasty leagues. I know my own dynasty podcast where you get to keep the players forever. And Tyler Eifert, I think, is going to be a stud in that format. I think he's someone that you surely want to target because in a year or two, he could be top 5 fantasy tight ends.
And, Shane, after that they grabbed Giovanni Bernard, which we've already touched on a little bit. But in terms of fantasy football right now, he's only been, being labeled as a change of pace back behind Ben Jarvis, Green Ellis. But, he's got this well-publicized versatility when it comes to catching the football, fitting Jay Gruden's West Coast offense very well. How do you think he produces next season in terms of fantasy? And, where would you take him in a fantasy draft?
Yeah, I think that Giovanni Bernard is going to come at a real nice discount. I'm looking at the My Fantasy League ADP, and right now he's going about 81st overall, so you're talking, 6th, 7th round in most leagues, maybe in a 10-team league at the top of the 8th round. And Ben Jarvis Green Ellis is right next to him in the running back rankings, 27th, 28th. I think Bernard's going to be a real value. I would much rather have him than, say, Jonathan Stewart. I'd much rather have him than Mikel LeSure or Andre Brown, because I think we could see a situation in training camp where, look, the talk now is Giovanni Bernard's going to be changed of pace back. He's only going to be part-time. And then when we get to training camp and he runs circles around Ben Jarvis Green Ellis, are you going to be able to keep him off the field? I think that's the biggest question. So I think in redraft leagues, Gio Bernard is heavily undervalued right now. We saw last year rookie running backs can make an impact, and we saw Doug Martin and Trent Richardson just step right in, Alfred Morris step right in and do their thing. I think that's what Gio Bernard's going to do. Now, is he going to be maybe quite that productive? No. I think Ben Jarvis Green Ellis is still going to get a lot of red zone looks, still be utilized in this offense. But if you're in a PPR league, if you're getting points for receptions, I think Ben Jarvis Green Ellis is an excellent target if you wait on a running back a little bit too long to get as an RB2 or an RB3 and have a little bit of upside there.
So yeah, with that being said, then Shane, Ben Jarvis Green Ellis, he quietly had a 1,000-yard season last year. Really coming on strong towards the end of the year. Now, based on what you're saying about Giovanni Bernard and what you're expecting out of him this year, can you see Ben Jarvis Green Ellis replicating that 1,000-yard season, or do you think that that he really is more going to be viewed as maybe a touchdown-heavy guy, as you were saying about getting touches in the red zone versus actually gaining significant yardage?
If both these guys are healthy, and that's always the caveat, then I think Ben Jarvis Green Ellis is going to take a step back from the yardage perspective. I think he could be a little more heavy touchdown, but once again, I think this Bengals offense has a lot of mouths to feed. If we talk about those tight ends again in the red zone, AJ Green's still going to be targeted in the red zone. So I don't even think there's going to be that many maybe rushing touchdowns to go around this season because both these backs are there. If Bernard breaks a big one. So it's been tough for me to take Ben Jarvis Green Ellis. Now, Giovanni Bernard has an injury history, so if he gets knocked out for a couple games, you might be able to get Ben Jarvis Green Ellis as your running back 4, and he immediately steps right in to kind of the role he was last year, where he's getting you yardage, maybe getting you a touchdown or two, and that'd be awesome. So I think where these guys are going is about both could end up being good values, but it's risky. I think that this Bengals offense, other than A.J. Green, is very risky this year just because of how many players there are to get the football, and you don't have enough footballs to go around. So you have to kind of make a bet. Is someone going to get hurt, and then if it's one of the tight ends or one of the running backs, the other guy's going to have a ton of value. That's the big question mark to me. So I'm passing on Ben Jarvis Green Ellis. I'd rather take my shot on Mark Ingram in New Orleans, or maybe take Le'Veon Bell in Pittsburgh, though he's steadily rising up draft boards already past Green Ellis. So I think there's a lot of other guys I think that can get me touchdowns, but are going to get the ball a little bit more.
So, Shane, should potential Bernard owners be aware of Green Ellis' ability to hawk touchdowns? Because I'm kind of the opinion that could happen a lot, and see Bernard out in those situations in short yardage. I think Green Ellis was something like 14 of 15, best in the NFL last year in short yardage, like 3rd and 1 and down near the goal line. So, is that something that knocks Bernard's value down overall unless he's, named the starter in the next couple of months?
Absolutely, and I think that's where your league settings come into play. If you're in a PPR league, if you're getting a point for receptions, I think Giovanni Bernard can make up those points and catches. I think he's going to get 3 to 6 catches a game if he's on the field, and that'll make up for a touchdown or close to it. So maybe he has a big game where he catches 9 passes, and that's going to make up for those points. Now, if you're just counting yardage, then I think you have some problems. And that's where, maybe I lean towards Ben-Jarvis Green-Ellis in a standard league where it's more touchdown heavy, just touchdown and yardage. So that's where I think the league comes into play. So if you have Gio Bernard on your team, I think you have to temper your touchdown expectations unless he just really can blow up and show that he can carry the rock from day one. Now, I don't know if he's going to do that. I think this is the Bengals training camp is going to be one of the fantasy situations to monitor for these tight ends and running backs. You're going to have to be watching Joe Reedy's Twitter account and these beat writers and really see what's going on. I think that the intelligent fantasy players are going to have a good handle on training camp, and that's what's going to prove to you, hey, here's the guy that's probably going to get the ball, here's the guy that's probably going to get the touchdowns. Is one of those two emerging? And if so, that's someone to jump on.
And you're absolutely right with Cincinnati's. They kind of have a bit of a quandary here with their running back situation as well as their tight end situation. I mean, it's a good problem for a football team because there's a lot of talent to go around. However, it's a bad it gives kind of a bad feeling for fantasy owners with any of these players. And just jumping back to the tight ends really quick, now that we've just touched on the running back aspect. Between Jermaine Gresham and Tyler Eifert, I realize that they're both probably going to be knocked down to later round picks this year. Now Gresham, he's been unreliable, but he's been productive though, as far as the fantasy football standpoint goes. Who, in your opinion, comes off the board first as far as a fantasy football draft would go? Would it be Eifert or would it be Gresham?
I think it's still going to be Gresham. I just think as we see the trend in rookie tight ends is not good. It doesn't really matter where they get taken. But for fantasy football, it's very rare to have a rookie tight end take the league by storm and be fantasy relevant and end the year as a top 12 fantasy tight end. It just really doesn't happen. And this year it's deep enough that it's probably not going to happen for Eifert, again, especially with Gresham there. So Gresham's going earlier, but both of them are kind of falling down. I mean, there are people in redraft leagues that are taking, Travis Kelce and Zach Ertz over Tyler Eifert, even though they were drafted later, just because they might not have as much to share with. And I still like Jermaine Gresham. I'm going to have him on a lot of teams as a tight end too in deeper leagues where I'm going to have a backup tight end because I like his talent. I think he can catch the football really well, and I think he does decent after the catch. I think he's still going to be on the field. So I think it could be a discount once again that because of the situation, people are leery. Take your shot. What's the worst that could happen? You can drop one of these guys. But if you end up with, say, like Kyle Rudolph or Vernon Davis or Dennis Pitta as your tight end one, and you want to have maybe another upside play, I think Jermaine Gresham's a good one to have as he keeps falling. He's starting to fall under Owen Daniels and being picked after him and guys like that. So, I really think that Gresham is still going to be the tight end to own for fantasy out of the two this year, and Eifert's going to be the better long-term answer.
So, Shane, I think we need to kind of address the elephant in the room now. I guess you could say the red-headed elephant in Mr. Andy Dalton. It seems the front office has kind of given him no excuse for bad production and performance now. Dalton wasn't statistically horrible last season per se, but he has more weapons than ever now. So, where do you rank him on the totem pole of quarterbacks? Is he a boomer bust kind of guy, or is he your starter? Where do you have him?
I don't like Andy Dalton. I really don't. Like, he's the one thing that holds me back from really feeling like the Bengals offense is going to be great. Because I go back, I watched that Houston Texans playoff game, and I just think, man, if the defense knows how to handle him, it's going to be very difficult. Now, right now on the redraft, I have him ranked as my 21st quarterback, and I think he's more of a QB2. He's a backup. He definitely doesn't crack the top 15 to me, and I think he's going to have trouble getting higher, but I do like a lot of his weapons. I think, A.J. Green's still going to produce. It doesn't matter who's a quarterback. But, I wonder if we actually see him emerge as a great fantasy quarterback, because he doesn't put up a ton of points. They have Ben-Jarvis Green-Ellis in the red zone, so I think you'll see some touchdowns snaked away from him. And if he has one of those games where he's just not as accurate or can't get the ball down the field, or if Green's being covered and he has problems getting it out, you're going to get a dud. Now, can you do a lot worse for your backup quarterback? Yeah. I think Andy Dalton can be a great backup quarterback for your fantasy team. But there's a lot of people that are taking him much higher than I would. I would much rather take a shot on Ryan Tannehill, the second-year quarterback for the Dolphins with all the weapons they got. I'd much rather take a shot on Jay Cutler with Mark Trestman's passing offense. Heck, if E.J. Manuel wins the job in Buffalo, he's a running quarterback. We've seen rookie running quarterbacks have success. So I'm probably not going to end up with Dalton on a whole lot of teams just because there's guys with upside I'd rather take as my second QB. But the weapons are there. I just don't know if we're going to see the production, the numbers for fantasy that's going to be very good. And I wonder if he has another year like he did, really what happens for Cincinnati and how they view him.
All very good points and all very accurate. And obviously, since we just touched on Andy Dalton, obviously we've got to talk about the guy when it comes to offense in Cincinnati right now, because obviously we'd never forgive ourselves if we didn't ask. How do you feel about A.J. Green next season? And do we dare to ask, is he your second receiver off the board?
I think he's absolutely my second receiver off the board. There's not even a question to me that I'd take him over Julio Jones and Brandon Marshall and Des Bryant and those players. Calvin's still going to go number one, but I'd almost rather wait around than get A.J. Green, around later if he's going in the second round of redraft leagues. That's pretty darn good to me. For me, I probably won't end up with him on a lot of teams just because I go running back early this year because I think wide receiver is pretty deep. But if you end up with A.J. Green as your number one receiver, you're set every week. There's not even a question of if he's going to produce because he produces week in and week out. He has some of those huge games. He rarely puts up duds. I think he's a lot more consistent than Julio Jones is. And I think I feel a lot better about him off the field than Brandon Marshall and Des Bryant. I feel a lot better about his health than Percy Harvin. It's just A.J. Green is probably the most reliable fantasy receiver, even beyond Calvin Johnson, who's had his own injury problems and his offense has had their own problems. So, for A.J. Green, he's my number 2 redraft wide receiver, is my number 2 dynasty wide receiver. He's the guy I have on a couple dynasty teams, and I'm pretty happy about it. I think it wouldn't matter if it wouldn't matter who's playing quarterback, if it's Andy Dalton, if it's Josh Johnson or John Skelton. I think A.J. Green's going to produce.
So, Shane, I guess we need to switch gears here for a second and touch on the defense at least briefly. I know you said you didn't like Marcus Hunt very much. Sean Williams may be a guy that can come in and start as a rookie. Is this a defensive squad or, defensive players that you would take highly, or how do you rank them in certain leagues?
Yeah, the defense is interesting. I mean, obviously the number one guy that pops to your mind from a fantasy IDP perspective is Vontaze Burfict and how he's going to be used this year. Is he going to move into the middle linebacker role? And if he is moved into middle linebacker, and even last year at outside, he was very productive with his tackles and his tackle numbers and racked up a lot of points. So I think he's still a player that's going to go very high in IDP drafts as a linebacker, especially in dynasty leagues where he's very, very young and has a lot of potential. And then, defensive lineman, defensive end is a really tough position this year with all the teams moving to 3-4 and guys standing up. It's tough to find a good defensive end. I think the Bengals are a team you can look for. I think Carlos Dunlap is one of the studs in the league at the defensive end position with the way he gets sacks and can also tackle. And then if you do require a defensive tackle, even if you don't, Geno Atkins is someone that you want to put on your defensive line just because he produces from that spot that not a lot of people do. The safeties, Sean Williams, if he can win that job, maybe has a lot of opportunities to get tackles, but we really haven't seen the secondary have to get a whole lot of tackle numbers for the Bengals. Reggie Nelson can make some big plays, but he didn't get a whole lot of tackle numbers, so comparatively to some of the other strong safeties in the league. So I think the secondary I kind of stay away from for Cincinnati, but the front seven has some value. It's another situation, I think, to watch in training camp with the linebackers and how that works out and who's going to be a 3-down player and who's not, and try to decipher that. You can find some fantasy gold, perhaps.
So when you're overlooking this entire Cincinnati Bengals team, is there one player in your mind that kind of sticks out as maybe a really good value fantasy pick, kind of a sleeper guy out there? Offensively, defensively, doesn't matter. Who you have as your big sleeper from Cincinnati this year?
I think it's Mohamed Sanu. I mean, I think that's the sleeper right there. If he wins that number 2 receiver job over Marvin Jones, and I like Marvin Jones too. I thought both of those were great picks last year. I think whoever wins that job, when A.J. Green's commanding double teams, if Tyler Eifert's not quite up to speed, and we know Gresham's inconsistent, that's going to be an important spot. That's going to be a spot where you're going to be one-on-one with a defender. And so if Sanu can develop, I thought he could develop into a number 2 wideout in the NFL and be a starter. So if he develops into that as a second-year player, then he can catch a lot of passes. He's a good possession wideout. And like I said, he's not going to see double teams. He's not going to see the safety coverage rolling his way. There's some opportunity there for a sneaky late-round wide receiver pick. You get him as a wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5, and I think you could have some games where you can plug and play him even. So he's kind of my sleeper pick this year. I've tried to pick him up in a couple draft master teams and hoping that he has a couple big games like we saw even late in the season.
So Shane, last question, I promise. And I think I already know what you're going to say, but we kind of have to go to the opposite end of the spectrum here. If you had to pick one player to avoid at all costs, fantasy-wise, in any kind of league, who's your man?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's BenJarvus Green-Ellis is probably the guy that I'm going to avoid just for where he's going, value-wise. You know, that's probably the player that I'm not going to take from this offense. I'd much rather have Bernard. If the value is right on the tight ends, great. I'll gladly take A.J. Green or one of the other receivers and take that play. I think it's him. Andy Dalton's pretty close for me, but I can see situations where he'd be a good QB2. But I just think BenJarvus Green-Ellis, there's a little bit of upside if Bernard gets hurt, but I really have a strong feeling that Bernard's going to win that job and do a lot more than people are saying right now. So I'll pass on Green-Ellis as his ADP is kind of ticking up. People are taking him higher now because of that talk, and Bernard's moving down. So I'd rather see that crisscross before I try to touch Green-Ellis.
Great advice once again, and a huge thank you to Shane Hallam for visiting us here on Bengals Central today. Shane, thanks so much for coming on. Let everyone know where they can reach you, where they can find your stuff, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, follow me on Twitter, @Shane P. Hallam. I try to answer any questions, fantasy. I end up in Twitter jail every Sunday giving who do I start advice. So follow me over there. And also follow Draft TV on Twitter, my new website, drafttv.com. I already have 2014 NFL Draft content up. You can click Fantasy at the top. I have fantasy rankings, Dynasty, Redraft, Rookie, IDP rookies. I got a ton of content up on the site. It's video-based. It's a lot of fun, so I hope people will check that out too.
That's very awesome. And I got to say that Shane here is a great guy. I know personally from Twitter that he interacts with almost every single one of his followers all the time. He really gives everyone, his time of day, and you really need to give him a follow. You certainly won't regret it. So, Shane, thanks again for coming on, my man. I appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me. It's always fun to talk football. I'll say that.
Again, that was Shane Hallam, president of DraftTV.com. Head over there for all your fantasy football and NFL draft needs, and make sure you give him a follow on Twitter. Like he said, he goes into Twitter jail every Sunday answering all of your specific questions on how to win your league. We'd also like to thank him just one more time for joining us. Sean, I think it's time we continue on with the rest of our show.
Hey, that's right, Chris. This brings us to the part of the show where we can at least attempt to give projections for Bengals players in the 2013 season. We're going to go ahead and provide yardage and touchdown totals for many of the offensive players, as well as why we feel these projections may be accurate. So I hope everybody listening has a pen and paper handy, because I'm sure these will be all spot on by season's end. And I really do hope that everybody sensed the sarcasm in my voice there. All right, let's go ahead and kick this off with you, Chris. What are your thoughts on the biggest playmaker on the Bengals offense, wide receiver A.J. Green?
Well, last year Green put up 1,300 yards and 11 touchdowns. A lot of folks are figuring he'll do better next season, but, and I think he will in some categories. I think, we're looking at a maybe 110 reception, 1,500-yard output, maybe 10 touchdowns. I think, the further development of Andy Dalton is going to help in the receptions and yards department as he continues to work on his ball placement and, staying mentally aware in the pocket. But I also think the new weapons on the offense, such as Giovanni Bernard and Tyler Eifert, are going to contribute to maybe the touchdown totals dropping in the red zone. So overall a better year, but he's not going to score as much, in my opinion. As far as fantasy football goes, though, I mean, like Shane said, he's the number 2 receiver no matter what kind of league you're running. And obviously after that we have to get to the man throwing him the football, which I'll hand over to you, Sean, with Mr. Andy Dalton.
Yeah, Andy Dalton is probably one of the most controversial players over the offseason. There are Dalton supporters, and there's guys, ready for a replacement for the guy already. It's absolutely all over the place when it comes to Bengals fans and Dalton. I don't think you'll really ever get the same answer with this guy, which may make this the toughest prediction to make of all. But I'm going to go ahead and make one anyway. And we might get some surprising feedback from this, both maybe good and bad. But, to put some numbers behind it, let's say, for sake of argument, let's say Dalton throws for about 4,300 yards with 33 touchdowns against 15 interceptions in 2013. And I know everyone's first reaction, they're thinking 4,300 yards, that's ridiculous. Dalton, hasn't even, really come close to the 4,000 yard mark, in his first 2 seasons. However, I think there's a lot of good reasons as to why this is absolutely attainable for Andy Dalton. And Chris, we were speaking before the show, and you actually brought up 2 very excellent points about the 4,000 yard club. One point that you made, which I personally love, is, and everybody remembers, their former favorite Bengal, Carson Palmer, he basically threw for 4,000 yards in the Oakland Raiders offense last season. And, as you know, he really didn't have any kind of weapons, at his disposal for the most part over there. Yes, they were behind in games. He was, getting a lot of garbage yards, but still not a very talented group of guys and a diverse group of guys like we're seeing in Cincinnati this year. And also, that kind of translates into the second point where the 4,000 yard club really isn't that exclusive anymore. It's not uncommon for quarterbacks to throw for 4,000 yards in the NFL these days. I mean, yes, back, even as recent as like the early 2000s, it was still kind of a big milestone. But in the pass happy league of late, the 4,000 yard club, isn't really an exclusive thing anymore. It's kind of translated to the 5,000 yard club for, the likes of Drew Brees, Matt Stafford and such. So yes, 4,300 yards, 33 touchdowns, 15 interceptions, and this is all basically going to be due to better production from Dalton due to the increase of weapons that are at his disposal. Last year everybody's double teaming A.J. Green, and he had 4 different number 2 wide receivers to try to work with throughout the season. He never really was able to establish solid chemistry with any of them because of the short duration in which they were in that spot. And, it seemed like just as he was trying to get, some chemistry going with Mohamed Sanu, Sanu went down for the year. And then Marvin Jones steps in, and just as Dalton's starting to build up some chemistry with Jones, the season ends, basically. So, I think Dalton will get some more consistency from the guys around him, especially with additions like Bernard out of the backfield and Eifert as a second tight end. He'll see some different packages. And, I think he has a much better year this year than he did in 2012. So that being said from Andy Dalton, let's just keep moving along to another one of his many, many targets that he will have this year on the Cincinnati Bengals offense, Mohamed Sanu. Chris, what's your take on him?
Well, Sanu's an interesting character because I believe he only played in 9 games last season and caught something like 16 or 17 passes. He also threw the touchdown pass against the Redskins, of course, like I always love bringing up. But, I think health is the biggest factor here for Sanu, and I think he showed in that 3 or 4 game stretch where he was really the number 2 option across from A.J. Green, that if he's healthy, he's the number 2 guy, thanks to versatility and just overall production. For me, I think he's somewhere in the 50 reception neighborhood, 600, 650 yards, 6 or 7 touchdowns. if he can play on all 16 games, that is. I think he's the clear-cut number 2 receiver, number 2 option in the receiving corps. And, I mean, he's not going to get a lot of attention from opposing defenses because, there's only 11 guys on the field, and you have 2 talented tight ends and A.J. Green to worry about already. I think that's going to free up Sanu more than folks are realizing. So for me, it's interesting what Shane was kind of touching on in terms of fantasy football is, he could very easily be a sleeper pick next season for a lot of people. He's going to come at a cheap cost. As long as we stop talking about it so much, I'm kind of hurting my own chances here. And even in dynasty leagues, I mean, this is a guy, he's had an injury past, but as far as dynasty leagues go, it's probably a target you want to jump on just based on what he flashed last season alone. With that being said, there is another receiver who could maybe threaten for Sanu's number 2 spot in Marvin Jones. We saw him kind of light it up at the end of last season. But, I'll hand the reins over to you for the Jones predictions.
All right, yeah, it sounds good. And, Marvin Jones, and, before I get into Marvin Jones, I've got to remind everybody, because obviously, Chris, what good are we if we don't plug our own show here? The wide receiver that Chris just mentioned, Mohamed Sanu, and the wide receiver that I'm about to speak about, Marvin Jones, happen to be guests on our first 2 episodes. So if you haven't listened to those 2 episodes of Bengals Central yet, be sure to get on that. Go to ProFootballCentral.com and give a listen and let us know what you think. Okay, enough of the plug. Let's talk about Marvin Jones and his 2013 projections. And here's the deal with Marvin Jones. It's kind of a funny situation with him. He could easily, end up winning a number 2 role on the Bengals offense this year. A lot of factors come into play there. First, he's the last guy that Andy Dalton had a lot of chemistry with opposite A.J. Green towards the end of the season. He really started to look like he was coming into his own. He's a very driven individual, as Chris and I found out during our interview with him. And the other thing is that Mohamed Sanu is a really versatile guy. He plays every wide receiver position. He lines up in the backfield. And as Chris mentioned, he also lines up at quarterback every so often. So there's a possibility that Marvin Jones could kind of sneak into that number 2 wide receiver position if Sanu is being moved around a lot. Now, for all intents and purposes, I do think that Sanu will be that number 2 guy. I really think that's where he's going to be used opposite A.J. Green. I think that he provides the biggest threat there at the number 2 spot that is currently on the Bengals roster, which unfortunately is going to limit the amount of touches that Marvin Jones ultimately gets in 2013. We're probably looking at somewhere around 28 to 30 receptions for him this coming season, which isn't much more than he had last year. You're probably looking at somewhere in the upper 200 yards areas, about 280, 290 yards, and probably a pair of touchdowns. There's just not enough targets to go around to make Marvin Jones very worthwhile as a fantasy option. However, I will say one thing in Marvin Jones' favor, and he may be, and this is for deeper fantasy leagues, he may be worth taking a big flyer on towards the very end of a draft if he's still on the board because of the injury concerns of Mohamed Sanu. Last year, Sanu went down and Jones became a guy. Jones is more fluent with the Bengals offense and has a chemistry build up with Dalton. So if Sanu would happen to go down again this year, Marvin Jones could be an absolute steal towards the later rounds of the draft because immediately then you have, the number 2 wide receiver of the Bengals offense on your hands then. So, speaking of more wide receivers for Cincinnati, as they have plenty of them, let's talk about the slot receiver in Andrew Hawkins. Chris, what's your take on Hawkins this coming year?
As far as Hawkins is concerned, it's hard to see where he sticks. I think he makes the final roster as maybe the 4th receiver, but in terms of how much he sees the field and what kind of fantasy impact he's going to have, it's going to be minimal, in my opinion, unless, like we stated already, the injury concerns with Sanu or even Jones pop up again. I think you're looking at him maybe being less effective than he was last season because, the coaching staff was kind of using him as a gadget player to maybe get those short yardage receptions. in certain situations, and that may be negated, and he may not be needed as much now with Giovanni Bernard on the roster with his ability to catch passes out of the backfield. So, I mean, Hawkins, I think he sticks around as a bubble screen guy, kind of gadget play guy. But, I mean, when we're talking fantasy football, I don't think we're looking at anything more than 20 or 30 receptions on the year, maybe a couple touchdowns in the red zone, maybe a big play. But I think he's really going to make his money on special teams. And as far as fantasy football goes, he's not really anything I look for unless, you grab him in free agency after an injury, an unexpected injury at that. Even in dynasty leagues, I don't think Hawkins is a guy you'd focus on really at all. I have my own concerns with him in regards to injury just because of his size. I mean, he's a tough little guy, and the coaching staff's done a good job of protecting him. But, at some point, that size does kind of worry me, which would play into fantasy drafting in my mind. And I kind of just hinted at the running backs, and I'll talk about Bernard later. But the man I don't want to talk about, so I'm going to hand off to you, is Mr. Ben Jarvis Green-Ellis.
You're right. In terms of fantasy football for 2013, this isn't really a guy that we're going to want to talk about, at least in a high regard. Green-Ellis, he served his purpose in 2012 with the Bengals. He quietly had a 1,000-yard season, really came on strong towards the end of the year. But to tell you the truth, he still wasn't a really viable, even a number 2 back for a fantasy team. He was almost better as a flex option. And this year, he will probably be downgraded even further. I don't even think that he's warranted even as a flex play, even in maybe some deeper leagues. He might be just good to have, as a handcuff maybe to Giovanni Bernard on a bench because, Ben Jarvis Green-Ellis' carries are going to be significantly lower this year. Last year, Green-Ellis had 278 carries. He averaged 3.9 yards per carry. And, he put up that 1,000-yard season, but, Bernard Scott, who was expected to be splitting carries with him last season, was just injury-plagued all year long. And that doesn't seem to be the case this year, with Giovanni Bernard coming in. You've got Bernard, you've got Rex Burkhead coming in, you've got Cedric Tillman around. Bernard Scott was already re-signed. Either way you look at it, you're going to have a change of pace back for Ben Jarvis Green-Ellis this year, which means his 278 carries from last year probably go down substantially, and I'm talking by about 100 carries. I'm looking at about the 180 carry range for Ben Jarvis Green-Ellis this year, which will net him significantly less than 1,000 yards this year. I'm talking about probably the 700 to 750 yard range. And as far as a lot of people's, ideas of Ben Jarvis Green-Ellis being, a kind of snaking touchdowns in the red zone, kind of vulturing away from guys like Giovanni Bernard and some shorter yardage guys. Yes, he'll probably do that, but I don't see many opportunities for him this year just because of how many weapons they have down there. If they put in some kind of jumbo packages using 3 tight ends, in Orson Charles, and Tyler Eifert and Jermaine Gresham down there. So let's say about maybe 4 touchdowns for Ben Jarvis Green-Ellis, which isn't much different from last year, but with the significant decrease in carries, the yardage will go down, and he just won't be effective. I say take a flyer on him in late rounds, but for fantasy purposes this year, he's not the back to have in Cincinnati. Now let's get Chris's opinion here on Giovanni Bernard, and is he possibly the back to have in Cincinnati?
Yeah, Bernard's a polarizing name. We heard Shane talk about, he wouldn't think that highly of him outside of dynasty leagues, but, for me, I think this is a guy that projects to have a very nice statistical season. And, I'm not just saying this because Marvin Lewis recently said it in an interview, but he reminds me of Maurice Jones-Drew in his rookie year with the Jaguars when he was backing up Fred Taylor. He didn't get as many carries, but he certainly made the most of what he had to work with, and I think I don't remember everything crystal clear about that season, but I can tell you right now Bernard is running behind one of the NFL's best run-blocking lines, and he's playing in a West Coast offense that suits him perfectly, hence Cincinnati making him the first running back off the board in the draft anyway. For me, Bernard is maybe a 120 carry guy, 600, 650 yards, 4 or 5 touchdowns. I'm still a believer that the law firm, if that's what you want to call him, is going to hawk a lot of touchdowns down there in the red zone. And then that's fine. That's how it'll play out in the rookie season. As far as the passing game goes, I think you're going to see Dalton checking down a lot more than he ever has because, Bernard is now that guy who can actually contribute. And I'm thinking somewhere between 50 receptions, 55 maybe, 400, 450 yards, 3 or 4 scores for Bernard. This is the type of guy who can take a reception and get 10 yards every time. It's, that's why he was brought in, and his presence alone, this isn't really fantasy football, but his presence alone is going to make Dalton's mental issues we saw last year, even in a clean pocket, go away a little bit. So, like Shane was saying, Bernard's a heck of a pick in dynasty leagues because Green Ellis, I think, maybe has 2 more years on his contract, and, at that point I don't see him keeping him around because in those 2 seasons, Bernard is going to develop into that every down back who carries the offense. So not amazing production this year in terms of fantasy, but he's definitely a name to consider and watch. Shane also hinted at, if for whatever reason Bernard lights it up in off-season and training camps and that sort of thing, and he gets named the starter, or it's looking like they'll use him a lot more than we think, then his fantasy value increases a lot. But as of right now, he's a dynasty guy. He's the guy I would pick over Green Ellis every time if you're looking at Bengals running backs only. But that may be a point of disagreement between me and Shane, which is fine. But the running backs, as polarizing as they are, we seem to have the same problem at the tight end position now with Tyler Eifert hanging around. So, Sean, I'll let you talk a little bit about the Pro Bowler, Jermaine Gresham, who's now feeling a little pressure.
Let's talk about Jermaine Gresham here. And I don't know if you do, but I certainly use the term Pro Bowler loosely when it comes to anybody really, and especially Mr. Gresham here. Nothing against the guy. He's been known to be a contributor, both at certain times for the Bengals and especially for fantasy football at times. However, his inconsistency is just all over the place. I know this has nothing to do with fantasy football, but Jermaine Gresham, he's constantly penalized, false starts, holding penalties. He really hasn't translated that all-around tight end that the Bengals have been hoping for, and that ultimately hurt him because of a certain first-round pick at the same position that the Bengals chose this year, which we'll get to in a minute. And this first rounder that just came in, obviously, he's going to hurt Jermaine Gresham's fantasy value this year significantly because he's going to steal some snaps from him. They might use some 2 tight end sets where Gresham may not be the primary target. So, Gresham's performance last year of just under 800 yards, and I think he had 5 touchdowns, was fine, but they wanted more out of him, and they didn't get more out of him. So they took the appropriate measures, and they went ahead and drafted an heir apparent. This year, Gresham, his value is going to drop, as I said. You're looking at probably somewhere around 50 receptions, maybe 500 to 500 yards receiving, and about 4 touchdowns. The rookie coming in certainly hurts Gresham this year. I think Gresham is still the tight end. And Shane said this earlier, Gresham's still the tight end that you want to take first from Cincinnati. He probably will be more productive, the most productive tight end out of Cincinnati this year, but still he's not a tight end that you want to target as a starter for your fantasy team. He's a solid backup at best, but for the sake of your fantasy team, you're absolutely going to want to look elsewhere. And as far as dynasty leagues, Gresham's really not the guy that you want to be hanging on to in that area as well because his future is very uncertain right now, and 2013 is going to play a major role in what ultimately happens with him. So let's switch gears and talk about the guy who looks to be the heir apparent for Jermaine Gresham, who is the 2013 first-round draft pick of the Bengals, Tyler Eifert.
I'm going to start sounding like a broken record here, but Eifert's kind of in the same boat as Bernard in terms of fantasy production, both short and long-term, really. Eifert, like Shane said, is a guy you grab in dynasty leagues, absolutely, probably as soon as you can, because he was the first tight end off the board for a reason. And, again, I think Gresham has 1 or 2 years left on his deal, and in those 1 or 2 years, Eifert's going to, develop. At least he should. Hopefully this isn't another Chase Kaufman, but he should develop into, an all-around tight end who fits the offense well. And so, as far as dynasty goes, he's your guy. Gresham's your guy, like you said, if you're doing redraft or what have you. And I don't know that Gresham necessarily leaves Cincinnati either way, but as far as this year goes, with Eifert's production, you're looking at maybe 40, 45 receptions, 400 yards, a couple touchdowns, maybe 2 or 3. I think you'll see him targeted a lot in the red zone, but I can't see the production being higher than Gresham's, especially because I still think Dalton has this thing where he goes to Green and Green only in the red zone, which is fine, because even if Gresham and Eifert take more coverage off of Green so Green can get more touchdowns, that's fine. Eifert is a guy who's going to learn this very quickly, and he showed in college with his catch radius and his role in the offense that he's going to explode in the next couple of seasons. But I can't see it this year with Green and Gresham on the roster. Even Orson Charles, I think, is going to hawk some receptions from these guys, in certain packages, and then you have just the insane amount of depth at receiver. We haven't even talked about guys like Kobe Hamilton and Ryan Whalen. So for me, Eifert has a way to go before he's a realistic fantasy option, unless we're talking dynasty.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because I remember kind of thinking about the Cincinnati Bengals in terms of fantasy football last year, back in 2012, and it looks like the Bengals' offensive value for 2013 will be roughly the same, due to, whether you want to call it, inexperience or inconsistency of players who are not named A.J. Green. None can really be counted on to start in a fantasy football league, at least with a great amount of confidence. It seems like that most offensive players should be considered as top-tier backups, such as, a guy like Andy Dalton, even though, we're predicting a great season for him, with over 4,000 yards, 33 touchdowns or whatnot. But, he's still probably not going to be a top 15 guy, in terms of fantasy football goes. So, there's options out there. And it looks like the Bengals are a team, aside from A.J. Green, that can really bolster your fantasy lineup, but maybe not worth a start on your team. However, luckily for Cincinnati, the lack of efficiency for a fantasy football team doesn't directly translate to the success of the actual club. So they've got that going for them at least. We expect, some great things from the Cincinnati offense with the amount of versatility that they're going to be able to present this year, which is awesome. So that being said, I believe that will just about do it for our fantasy football-themed Bengals Central episode. Chris, what do we have coming on next week, man?
Yeah, guys, we really hope you'll join us next week because we're going to be coming at you with all the latest news and happenings from the first week of Bengals OTAs. Just like rookie minicamp, just guys in shorts running around, but there's certainly some news tidbits we're probably going to need to be breaking down, including, player performances, unfortunately, possibly some injuries, and, of course, we'll talk about some of the most heated positional battles, which, if I had to bet, we're going to be talking a lot of linebackers and wide receivers, and probably a guy named Ray Malaluga. So if that, floats your boat, feel free to tune in. We also have a special announcement for our fans. Starting next week, we'll be answering your questions live on the show via a new mailbag segment we dreamed up. So make sure you give us a follow at BengalsCentral and tweet us any and all questions you may have over the course of next week. We'll take, Bengals questions, general NFL, AFC North. We'll even take entirely random questions as long as they're appropriate, So please ask me what my favorite beer is. I could talk about it all day. remember, that's at Bengals Central with any questions you may have, and you'll make it on the show and maybe get some new followers in the process.
Absolutely, yeah. We're really looking forward to that new segment. Chris and I are very excited to see what you guys throw at us, and we'll do our best to answer all or as many as we possibly can fit in the show. So as always, be sure to go to our page on ProFootballCentral.com and click on the On It banner to receive 15% off your next purchase for everything you need to thrive, which is their logo, which I think is pretty cool. Now, remember, let us know what y'all think of the show, and like Chris said, hit us up for the mailbag segment on Twitter at BengalsCentral. So for Chris Rowling, I am Sean O'Donnell. Hooday.
Thanks for tuning in to the Bengals Central Podcast. Make sure to tune in next week so you don't miss out on any Bengals info you want to know.